My primary perpetrator was my mother.
As a child, I suffered emotional, sexual, physical abuse, some of which caused my hearing loss. As a young adult, I experienced physical, sexual, and verbal abuse mostly in one long-term relationship.
It's affecting women with disabilities so much more than, unfortunately, just about any other issue. I think it's important to understand that the violence is a systemic result of many of the oppressions women with disabilities face. Unfortunately, for many women with disabilities, this is really what their day is made up of different forms of violence, whether it's physical violence or system abuse.
La forme de violence, il y a économique, physique, non physique, il y a plusieurs. Et on est une petite communauté et on doit se taire. Et si on le dit, toute la communauté va savoir qu'on souffre de violence. Alors aussi, l'accessibilité est comme fermée pour nous. Il faut prendre une interprète, il faut avoir confiance à l'interprète, aux entendants.
I actually started to do this work as a result of my own experience of being in a relationship that was emotionally abusive. And I really didn't sort of know what was going on in my life in terms of it being identified as abusive until I started connecting with other women. And it was those conversations with women and their stories that I then started to see what was happening in my life and identifying it as abuse. I later went on to try and find support. And the community that I was living in at that time, there was no abuse services that were wheelchair accessible. So I ended up going somewhere for group counseling, and they had to haul me up and down the stairs every time I would go. And so I was imagining, like, here I am, someone who is, fairly able to advocate on my own behalf and express my needs in the ways that I do. And I thought, if I'm having difficulty finding services, what are other women experiencing?
When you're relying for someone to help you, if you get supported independent living, it's only a couple of hours. The rest of the time, you have to be reliant upon people to help you do the things you do. Well, what if that person, I've heard people say, you mean they're not supposed to cash my check and keep some of the money? No. Then, of course, the next question is, well, if I report that person to the police, what happens to me? What do I do? I usually try to give myself an hour to decompress because of the way he throws me in a chair. I sometimes have spasms for up to an hour, despite me telling him to slow down. Sometimes I have to get angry and use the policy of making him leave my apartment for 10 minutes for him to understand. He keeps telling me to hurry up, which is when I raise my voice and tell him to leave me alone. And then he gets upset and leaves. One of my attendants sometimes didn't listen to what I was saying, so I would get angry. One time, he took my dinner away and left. He was mean. It's just that I don't think he really likes the job. It's just a paycheck for him. He just wants to get through the appointments. I know he's overworked.
A woman is living in an institution, or even when they're at home and they have to deal with caregivers who most of the time are wonderful, but there are situations of being so vulnerable and not being able to find the help because of their vulnerability. And that's a huge, huge problem. We had a woman who called last year because she felt violated by her caregiver, and she had talked to her CLSC, and it was one of those situations again where she was falling through the cracks because because of the machine, the bureaucracy. She even told us that that same person was still coming to her, although she had complained about it.
I had great concern about my care worker. I can't take a bath since I wear my brace into the bathtub. I do it myself, and I am careful. But when dealing with external people, I have concerns. These people are supposed to be trained, yet they've treated me and my dad inappropriately. They basically force-fed my dad. So sometimes you felt victimized by service providers who are in authority and can act abusively because there's no accountability.
I was a victim of domestic abuse for 2 years. I was living with a man whom I met. He was nice at first. I was worried, but I gathered up my courage and decided to live with him. He would beat me and ridicule me every time I would refuse, for example, to give him money. At first he would just threaten me and I'd give him what he wanted, but when I started saying no, when I had no money, he'd get angry. He would scream at me and he ended up hitting me. During intimate moments, he was also violent. I remember one time we saw each other during lunch break, and when he came up to me to say bye, he kissed me so violently by biting my lip. I even went back to work with my lip completely swollen.
We can say that in the region of Montreal that there are 7 houses that are accessible to wheelchair. But as you know, accessibility is something very general. There's communications and there are other aspects of accessibility. So the women often fall through the cracks. We're also very concerned about the emergency. Women who are in a situation of emergency where they need to leave their home to get help, to get to a shelter. And with a disability, sometimes they cannot leave because, for instance, with the adaptive transportation, there's no confidentiality. And you know that when you're in a situation of violence, you need that confidentiality.
L'abus sexuel est très complexe parce que dans la population générale, ce n'est pas accepté qu'une femme en situation de handicap soit abusée sexuellement. Déjà, c'est très difficile d'accepter que les femmes handicapées, on ait une sexualité, qu'on soit désirable. Donc pour eux, de dire, mais mon Dieu, qui oserait en plus abuser d'elle, c'est très difficile à accepter pour la population générale. Moi, quand j'en parle, on me dit, mon Dieu, non, ça n'existe pas, qui oserait, ça se fait pas, c'est des histoires d'horreur, alors que ce n'est pas ça.
Many years ago, I was raped by my brother. I was devastated by my brother raping me. I do not understand why he would do something like that. I still have bad dreams. Another time, it was during Christmas dinner at my father's house, and I think I was over 20 years old at the time. One of my uncles followed me and sexually assaulted me. He hurt me very much. And when I denounced him, he tried to lie and say that I invented it and it wasn't true.
A lot of people think that it's easier to sexually abuse young women because they're vulnerable, especially if the person is in a wheelchair or some kind of mobile device. So it's very they feel helpless because they can't do anything about it, and it just makes me feel awful to think things like that happen almost every single day. If your teacher's in high school or anything, or physically abusing you, like yelling at you, calling you stupid, saying that you're wrong about things, instead of trying to listen to you and work with you about how to get around the problems and issues in school. And like, I got bullied a lot. When the bullying is online, like using the internet, it can happen like using Facebook, Twitter, emails, maybe a work website that lots of people use, or a high school website, because then like there's an unlimited amount of abuse that can happen. And a lot of the students who get abused that way, like they try to kill themselves because they're going through so much pain and misery and suffering, and some of them don't want to talk to anybody about it.
It's a double-edged sword. As a man, it's hard to say I was abused. In my experience, some people expect you to be strong, even those with disabilities. You can be strong up to a point. What I went through with the abuse, we were told to be strong, but when we do speak up, we're not even taken seriously. That's what I find. You know, sexual abuse happens for men with disabilities, but we don't talk about that. It's like we're not strong enough to even defend ourselves. Many people categorize newcomers and do not give them a chance here. My disability, the language barrier, the fact that I did not know much about my new country, and having a son with autism. Not knowing how to read and write well, my fear and lack of self-esteem. I didn't know how to ask for what I needed.
Au niveau de l'immigration, là, pour les personnes sourdes, là, les personnes pensent que les signes, c'est universel. Dans différents pays, il y a différents signes. Les Français, l'anglais, on a différents... C'est comme les personnes attendantes. Le ASL, ça dépend des pays. Ici, on a la LSQ. Dans d'autres pays, là, l'obstacle est encore pire pour un immigrant qui est personne sourde et qui a une autre langue. Alors, nous, on peut l'accueillir, mais on a une limite aussi. Il faut qu'on essaie de discuter, de faire plus de la gestuelle. Et souvent, on l'accompagne avec un interprète et moi, l'intervenante, et la personne femme immigrante, et pour voir ses besoins. Alors, il y a beaucoup d'obstacles. Pour moi, là, pour les personnes immigrantes, il y a beaucoup de barrières. C'est pire pour moi.
When I think of elder abuse, I think of lack of for a person who is physically unable. I think of the lack of personal care, like changing of a diaper or bathing or doing your hair. Just the personal touches that make all the difference in the world. Aging presents isolation as a natural part of the picture for everybody. And certainly any disability within a senior's life, again, isolates them even further. So, if I could suggest, it's not just certain impairments that cause isolation. It's aging in general, and aging with disabilities even further.
Family is expected to be the support for seniors and the disabled. And very often, family is either detrimental to the person's well-being or not available. I see 70-year-olds taking care of 90-year-olds. I had an incident where I was talking to a gentleman and he was just about in tears. He must have been close to 90. And his son was abusing him, and he was just having a terrible time with this man.
One thing I see a lot of in seniors, I see people after their money. I've certainly seen it in stepchildren, but when it comes down to our own children taking our money, I see grandchildren going after the pharmaceuticals of the grandparents also. I can talk about my mother, who lived with me till she was about 101. And in the last 10 years, she had dementia. She was totally helpless. And there were so many caregivers coming in every day. And I, of course, was caught in the middle of trying to coordinate it all and take their distress, but without any authority, of course, unless I paid for them. But some of the things that happened, well, on one occasion she was slapped because she couldn't take her pills.
That oppression, whether it's through the way they're treated by a caregiver, by a person on the bus, by a person in a public space, by a possible employer who doesn't give them the opportunity, that I would say, because we now recognize ableism as a form of violence, that I think that speaks profoundly to why Dawn continues to focus on this area of work.
It is an abusive relationship within the power struggle. There's no compassion in the system. They tell you what disability you are and how disabled you are, and given the supports according to a box that you're defined in. The staff didn't seem to have any training or interest in knowing about his disability. He's not mobile, and they put him on the table for surgery, and he dislocated something. His hip, I think. He's still not all better.
A lot of people go to healthcare providers for care, but feel like they don't get the care they need and feel neglected. I had to be hospitalized, and I need help with almost everything I do. Being in a hospital was hard because I always came last. Because I need to be fed. I need to be bathed. I always ate cold meals because they'd put it on the table so everyone else, and only then come back to feed me.
I think when trying to negotiate your needs, whether they're visible and invisible disabilities, it's magnified when they have to engage in the system. And unless you are economically comfortable, you are subjected to the system. And in fact, when I work with people who have to go before the justice system, the one thing that I find helps is having people understand that it's not you that is disabled. It is the system that is creating a disabling effect.
N'oublions pas que ces femmes-là vivent des situations de violence où l'abuseur, souvent, c'est son aidant naturel, c'est un membre de la famille, c'est le préposé, donc c'est dans son cercle direct, c'est des gens avec qui elle vit, qu'elle connaît. Est-ce que ça va être possible pour elle de les dénoncer puis de revivre avec eux aussi? Est-ce que le soutien va être là? Je ne pense pas. Souvent, des femmes vont se retrouver difficilement à se sortir de ce cercle-là puis de vivre leur vie en sécurité. Voyez-vous comment ces femmes-là, avec toute leur éducation, avec tout ce qu'elles sont, elles ont eu de la difficulté à dénoncer des abus qu'elles ont vécus?